In a large, quiet town where the sun set behind the mountains and the nights were cold and dark, something unusual occurred in one of the upscale restaurants along the waterfront. There, amid the elegant tables and exquisite dishes, dined a young man known to everyone as a regular. He was no stranger to the luxurious setting, but that evening, something felt different. He had arrived early, hoping to enjoy a peaceful meal alone, something that was rare for him. As he sat at the corner table, he couldn't help but notice the other guests, well-dressed, busy with their conversations, laughing over wine, while he just wanted a moment of solitude. The waiter, a young woman with striking features, approached him with a smile, offering the day's special. "I'll have the seafood platter, please," he said, his voice calm yet with an underlying tension. The waitress nodded, her eyes flickering with something he couldn't quite place. She disappeared into the kitchen, and as he sat there, lost in his thoughts, he felt the presence of someone else, a man seated at a distant corner of the restaurant. The man wasn't ordinary. He had an air of authority and power, and his eyes never seemed to leave the young man. The billionaire, as the staff called him, was known for his silent demeanor and sharp gaze, always observing the happenings around him. Minutes passed and the waitress returned, placing the seafood platter before the young man. He glanced up at her, thanking her, but she hesitated before walking away. As she did, he caught her looking back at the billionaire. It was as though something was off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. The young man took a bite, savoring the taste, but something wasn't right. His mind wandered back to the billionaire's gaze. There was something unsettling about it, like he was watching not just his actions but his very thoughts. The quiet tension in the restaurant grew, and the air felt heavier with every passing minute. As he ate, the billionaire's presence grew more intense. He didn't speak, didn't move, just watched. Then, the young man felt it, a soft whisper in his ear, as though the words had come from nowhere. "You should be careful what you wish for." It wasn't the waitress's voice. It wasn't anyone's voice. But it felt real, it felt close. The young man froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. Was it a trick of his mind, or was the billionaire somehow communicating with him? He glanced up, but the billionaire's eyes remained locked on him. That unblinking stare sent a shiver down his spine. The atmosphere in the room seemed to shift, the air becoming thick with unspoken tension. At that moment, the waitress returned, her expression tense as she stood near the table. "Is everything to your liking?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. Before the young man could answer, the billionaire rose from his table, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. As he passed, his gaze met the young man's once more, and this time, it was filled with something dark, something far from friendly. The waitress watched nervously as the billionaire approached the door, his every step calculated. As he reached the exit, he turned back toward the young man and smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, one that hinted at something far more dangerous. The young man felt a chill run through him as the door slammed shut behind the billionaire, but the unease lingered. Something was wrong. And he had no idea what the billionaire's intentions were, or why he had been so intrigued by him. What had just happened? And what would happen next? The answers would come soon, but not in a way anyone could have anticipated. The evening stretched on, and the silence in the restaurant thickened. The waitress stood frozen, her gaze fixed on the door where the billionaire had just exited. Her hand still trembled, unable to shake the feeling that she had just become a part of something much larger, something outside her usual, quiet life. The young man, though uncertain as to why, felt an intense need to learn more about this unusual visitor. His once ordinary meal had now turned into a mystery to be unraveled. Something about the way the billionaire had looked at him, with that unsettling gaze, seemed to suggest that he was watching more than just his actions, he was watching his deepest thoughts. "Is everything okay?" The waitress's voice broke through his thoughts, and he realized she was standing by his side again, this time more cautious. Her eyes darting toward the door where the billionaire had left. The young man stared at her, his own confusion now matching hers. "I'm not sure," he replied honestly. "Who was he?" Her face seemed to pale at the question. You don't know, she asked, lowering her voice as though speaking about something forbidden. That was Alexander Vortnikov, the one everyone in the city whispers about. Well, no one really knows for sure what he does, but he controls things in ways you can't even imagine. People say he's involved in all sorts of businesses, from technology to, well, things we can't talk about. The young man raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the sudden revelation. And what does he want with me? The waitress hesitated, then leaned in closer. I don't know, but I've seen him watch people like that before. It's as if he chooses them, selects them for something. And once you're on his radar, you don't get to leave. Her words felt heavy, and the air in the room seemed to grow even thicker. It was as if everything in the restaurant had suddenly become part of a larger, unspoken game. The young man felt a chill crawl up his spine, and his instincts told him to leave. But he couldn't shake the feeling that staying was the only choice. As the waitress walked away, his gaze instinctively shifted toward the door. Outside, the billionaire had already disappeared into the night. But the feeling of being watched remained, a lingering presence, like an invisible thread pulling at him. What had Vortnikov wanted? Why had he chosen him? And what would happen next? These questions gnawed at his mind as he sat there, alone, in a world that had just shifted, the shadows growing longer in the dimly lit restaurant. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room as the door creaked open again. The young man stiffened. He hadn't heard anyone enter, but a familiar voice cut through the silence. Don't think you're leaving so easily. The billionaire stood there, his presence filling the doorway like a storm cloud. His gaze, as piercing as before, settled on the young man. This time, there was no smile, just an intensity that made the room feel smaller, more suffocating. There's something I need you to do, he said, his voice low, almost too calm. And if you want to leave here with your life intact, you will. The young man felt the weight of the words, and for the first time, he wondered if leaving was ever going to be an option. The young man froze. The billionaire's words hung in the air, charged with a threatening calmness that seemed to suffocate the space between them. His mind raced, trying to grasp what was happening. Was this a joke? A twisted game? Or was it something far more dangerous? Why me? He finally managed to ask, his voice shaky, though he tried to hide his fear. Vortnikov didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving the young man's face, as if searching for a crack, some sign of weakness. Then, without breaking the silence, he motioned for the young man to stand. You've been chosen, he said simply. I don't choose randomly. You have something that will be valuable to me. The young man swallowed hard, his instinct screaming at him to run. But his legs felt like lead, his body frozen in place as the billionaire moved ever closer, his presence becoming more overwhelming with each step. Tell me what you want, the young man said, his words coming out more forcefully than he had intended. He was done with being passive, done with waiting for something he couldn't understand to happen. If he was going to be dragged into whatever this was, he needed answers. Vortnikov smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. I want you to do something very simple for me. You will go to a location, there are people who need your help. You'll make sure they are taken care of. They are sensitive to certain matters, but with your involvement, things will go much smoother. Who are these people? The young man couldn't help but ask, his voice betraying a mix of fear and curiosity. Vortnikov's expression darkened. You'll find out soon enough. But know this, you'll be watched. Every move you make, every decision you take will be observed. Don't disappoint me. The room grew colder as the billionaire's gaze turned into something more like a warning, a silent threat that was hard to ignore. It felt as though everything, even the air, had been tailored for this moment, this exchange that could not be undone. The young man felt a rush of conflicting emotions, fear, uncertainty, but also something else. He didn't know what exactly, but it was there. Something deeper, something that stirred within him. I don't understand, he whispered, almost to himself. What makes you think I'll do this? Vortnikov leaned in, his voice now a mere whisper. Because you have no choice. You'll either do what I ask, or you'll regret it. I don't make threats lightly. The young man stood still, his mind racing. His whole life had been ordinary up until now, working a mundane job, living day by day, finding comfort in the little things. But this was different. This was no longer a choice between yes and no. This was survival. He looked at the billionaire, knowing that running, avoiding, or even refusing wouldn't save him. There was no way out. Not now. And as much as he hated it, he knew his life had just shifted into something he couldn't control. Where is this place? He asked, his voice resigned. Vortnikov's smile returned, colder than before. Good choice. I'll send someone to guide you. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. Remember, he said, his voice steady, there's no going back. With that, he exited, leaving the young man standing in the middle of the room, his thoughts racing, his heart pounding. Whatever he had just agreed to, it was only the beginning. And as he turned to face the empty space around him, he couldn't help but wonder how deep this web really went. What had he gotten himself into? And more importantly, how far would it pull him? The young man stood there, frozen in place, his mind struggling to process the surreal encounter. He had agreed to something, but the weight of the decision was settling in slowly, like a heavy stone sinking deeper and deeper. The silence of the restaurant seemed deafening now, the once comforting murmur of conversations reduced to an eerie hum in the background. His thoughts raced as he tried to figure out what exactly had just happened. Alexander Vortnikov. The man was known for his wealth and power, but the depths of his influence were still unknown to most. And now, somehow, he was involved in this. In something he couldn't even define. A chill ran through him as he realized he had just crossed an invisible line. There was no turning back. No simple escape. Not that he had ever thought about escaping before. His life had been uneventful until this point, and now everything felt different, intensified, as if the world itself had become more dangerous, more uncertain. He looked around the restaurant again, but it felt distant now, foreign. The waitress had disappeared, and the other diners carried on with their own lives, unaware of the subtle drama that had just unfolded in the corner. Suddenly, he felt a presence behind him. He turned instinctively and saw a man standing just inside the doorway. He was tall, dressed in a sharp suit, and had an air of quiet authority. The man's gaze locked onto his, and without saying a word, he nodded toward the door. I'm here to take you to the location, the man said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. The young man's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this, didn't even know where the location was. Yet, somehow, he felt as though he had no choice but to follow. This was the path now. Where are we going? He asked, his voice uncertain. The man didn't respond immediately, just gestured for him to follow. They walked out of the restaurant, and the brisk night air hit him, sharp and cold. The streets outside were quiet, the only sounds the distant hum of cars and the occasional footsteps echoing through the empty space. They reached an unmarked black car parked just a few feet away. The man opened the door, motioning for him to get inside. The young man hesitated for a moment, but then, as if compelled by something greater than his own will, he stepped inside. The car's interior was dark, sleek, and immaculate. No words were exchanged as the vehicle started moving, gliding smoothly through the city streets. The young man stared out of the window, watching the city lights blot past, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Where was he going? Who were these people? What had Vortnikov meant when he said he would be watched? And why did it all feel so suffocating? The car took him far from the city center, driving into an area he didn't recognize. The buildings grew sparse, the streets dimmer, and soon, the vehicle slowed and turned onto a narrow road surrounded by trees. They came to a stop in front of a large, imposing house. It looked old, almost as if it had been abandoned for years, its windows dark and unwelcoming. The man in the suit turned to the young man. This is the place. Get out. The young man didn't move at first. He was overwhelmed by a sense of dread. What had he gotten himself into? Don't worry, the man continued, his tone icy. You're here for a reason. And you're not leaving until you fulfill your part of the deal. The young man's heart pounded in his chest. The door opened and the man stepped out, waiting for him to follow. Reluctantly, the young man opened the door and stepped into the cold night. The house loomed before him, its eerie silence beckoning. As he walked toward the entrance, he could feel the weight of every step. Something was waiting inside. Something he wasn't prepared for. But there was no turning back now. The young man stood at the threshold of the dark house, the door creaking slightly as he pushed it open. He could feel his pulse quicken, every sense heightened, as if the air itself was thick with secrets and danger. The man in the suit was already walking ahead of him, leading the way without a word, his footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. Inside, the house was just as imposing as it looked from the outside, dimly lit, with old, creaking wooden floors beneath their feet. The walls were adorned with dark paintings and strange sculptures, the kind that made him feel watched, as though eyes followed his every move. He tried to shake off the sense of unease crawling up his spine, but it was hard. It felt as if the very air inside this house carried a history of things that should never have been known. The man in the suit stopped at a large door at the end of the hall, turning to face him. This is it, he said, his voice cold and final. Whatever happens next is on you. The young man nodded, his throat dry. He didn't want to go through with this. He didn't know what he was supposed to do, or what he had gotten himself into. But as he stood there, he realized he had no choice. The path was already set, and he was just a pawn in a much larger game. He stepped forward and pushed the door open, entering a room filled with a dim, reddish glow. In the center of the room was a table covered with maps, documents, and strange devices that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie. Sitting at the table, his hands steepled in front of him, was none other than Alexander Vortnikov. The billionaire looked up as the young man entered, his expression unreadable. You're here, he said softly, almost like a whisper, yet his words felt heavy, like a sentence. Now we can begin. The young man didn't speak. He couldn't. His heart was racing, and a cold sweat formed on his brow. Whatever was about to happen, he wasn't ready. But he was here, and there was no turning back. Vortnikov had made that clear. The billionaire gestured to the table. I need you to look at this, he said, pointing to the map that spread across the surface. You'll understand what you need to do soon enough. The young man stepped forward cautiously, his eyes scanning the maps and papers. They were filled with coordinates, locations he didn't recognize, and names that meant nothing to him. It was all so confusing, so foreign. What is this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Vortnikov's gaze darkened. These are places that need attention. You're going to be my eyes and ears. My messenger. And if you do well, if you deliver what I need, then you'll be rewarded. If not, well, we both know what happens to those who disappoint me. The words struck him like a blow. The young man took a step back, the weight of what Vortnikov was asking becoming painfully clear. He wasn't just involved in a business deal or a simple errand. He had been pulled into something much darker, something that could consume him if he wasn't careful. But as he stood there, looking at the map, he realized he had a choice. He could either accept this path, follow the billionaire's orders, and hope he could get out unscathed, or he could try to fight back, somehow, and risk losing everything. In the end, there was no simple answer. The game had started, and there was only one way forward. I'll do it, the young man said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. Vortnikov's lips curled into a satisfied smile. Good, he said, standing up from the table. You'll start tomorrow. Be ready. And remember, if you fail, there will be no second chances. As the billionaire turned and left the room, the young man stood there, staring at the map before him. He had no idea what was in store, or how far he'd be pushed. But one thing was certain: his life had changed forever. He was no longer just an ordinary man. He was now part of something much larger, a web of power and danger from which there might be no escape. And as the door clicked shut behind him, the weight of his decision settled in. He was trapped in a game with no clear rules, and the stakes were higher than he could ever have imagined.